Adam, thank you so much for being here with us today. I wish you could be here. We had 6 buzzing classrooms with the science of learning. It was amazing. I'm just starting to hear what everybody is saying. So just thank you. This is beyond fantastic. If it's okay with you, I'll introduce you in Hebrew, and then I'll give you the floor. So, אדם בוקסר הוא מורה למדעים בבית ספר בצפון לונדון. יש לו ידע עצום והבנה שאין לכם מושג בתחום של מדעי הלמידה, ובעיקר מומחיות יוצאת דופן בלהביא את מדע הלמידה לכיתה, באמת. הוא גם מייסד שותף ומנהל את תחום החינוך בחברה שנקראת Carousel Learning, שזאת פלטפורמה מקוונת חדשנית שמאפשרת למורות ומורים ממש לבנות אסטרטגיות תרגול עם התלמידים במקצועות שונים, ומתבססת על כל מה שדיברנו פה קודם, על שליפה, על ריווח בזמן, על תרגול מגוון, מכשיר מאוד גמיש, מאוד מאוד מרשים. חוץ מזה, הוא כותב בלוג מצליח, כותב ועורך מגוון ספרים וחומרי לימוד עבור מורים, מעביר ימי למידה והרצאות ברחבי אנגליה ובעולם, ויותר מהכל, מורה ואיש חינוך מעורר השראה במלוא מובן המילה. אני לא אוסיף יותר מילים כדי שהוא יוכל לספר לכם בעצמו. אז אדם, we are so lucky to have you, and the floor is yours.
תודה רבה, בוקר טוב, מה שלומכם? ממש כבוד להיות כאן. למרות שאני רוצה לדבר בעברית, אני לא חושב שזה רעיון טוב, אז אני מצטער ואני מבקש סליחה, but I'm going to speak in English. First, I sometimes speak too quickly. I know you have a translation, but if I do speak too fast, please just wave at me, like this. Can you hear me okay? Problem with the sound? שומעים? בסדר, okay. So first, let's do a practice. If I speak too fast, can everyone go like this, please? Voila. Okay, excellent, brilliant. So anytime I'm going too fast, just do that, no problem. What I'm going to try and do is share my screen. Let's see if that works. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen? Amazing. You can see my screen? Some of you nodding. Okay. Can you see my smiley face? Just nod like this.
We can, we see everything.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so a quick introduction. Thank you, Efrat, for that introduction. My name is Adam, and like Efrat said, I'm a science teacher. I teach at a school in North London. The school that I teach at is called the Totteridge Academy. And I've taught there now for 6 years. I'm also the education director of this company called Carousel Learning, where, like Efrat said, we do quizzing, we do online learning, we do retrieval practice, that kind of thing. I have a podcast as well. It's mostly for an English audience, but if you are interested, we send our podcast out every Friday, and it's a lot of fun. There's jokes, but there's also a lot of important education content. So in our last episode, for example, we spoke about safeguarding. I don't know how to translate safeguarding, but it's the way you deal with students who have, let's say a child comes to you and they tell you that they have a parent who is hitting them or something like that. And in the last episode, we spoke about how we have all these rules for what we're allowed to say and what we're not allowed to say. But what we don't learn about is how to be compassionate and how to be humane when that child has a conversation with us. I have a book as, oh, sorry, it's gone. Come back. I have a book as well called Teaching Secondary Science, which you might like, especially if you're a science teacher. You can grab me on X, which used to be known as Twitter, or you can get me on Blue Sky over there. You can email me, no problem, anytime. If you have any questions, anything you want to talk about, resources, texts, whatever you like, just email me, no problem. You don't have to go through Deltã or through Efrat or whoever, just email me, it's not an issue. And then if you do like the things we speak about today, then you can also catch my blog, which is A Chemical Orthodoxy, where I write about a lot of this as well. Now, Efrat asked me to talk a little bit about my journey as a teacher. And I specifically wanted to talk to you about how my teaching has changed across the year. I've been teaching for 11 years now, but my teaching, the Adam that you see here is very different to the Adam that you will have seen 11 years ago. So we're going to start with this picture. This is me. This is me on my first day of school 11 years ago. You might not be able to tell from the picture, but I'm a lot younger in that picture. It's 11 years ago. There's more grey in my beard now than there was then. I have 2 children, so I haven't slept in about 6 or 7 years. And here in this picture, I'm looking very fresh, very young, very enthusiastic. The main thing, though, is not the way that I look, but is the thoughts that I had in my head and the type of teacher that I was and the things that I believed in. Oh, I forgot to say, if anyone has any questions, I'm going to save time at the end. So just write them down, and then at the end we can do questions, no problem. Sorry, back to young Adam, who we'll call young Adam, Adam Hatzair, the young Adam. What are the things that Adam used to think? Well, one of the things that Adam used to do a lot of was something called group work, which is when students work in small groups where they kind of learn together, you know, groups of 3 or 4, and they might do a project or a presentation or something like that. Another thing that Adam really used to do a lot of was discovery and inquiry-based learning. Now, these were things where I would give them a topic and I might give them some kind of framework or some kind of guidance, and they would have to study that and look that up and work that out for themselves. So I might say to students, okay, today we're going to be learning about the 2 different types of bonding, ionic bonding and covalent bonding, because I'm a science teacher, a chemistry teacher in particular. And some of the students might go off and research. They might use an online website or a textbook, and they might research ionic bonding. And some of the students might research or learn about covalent bonding. Or we might do an experiment. And I'd say to students, today we're going to learn about springs. I'm not going to really tell you anything about springs, but I'm going to give you some equipment. I'm going to maybe give you a couple of small pieces of information, and you're going to try and work out the relationship between how a spring extends and the amount of force that is applied to the spring. So things along those lines. I also used to believe in something called a transferable, I think I've spelled that wrong, but I'm not sure, a transferable skill. Now, transferable skill is something like you might have heard of, something like critical thinking or creativity or thinking like a scientist. This is a good one as well. So about how you use evidence, how you use numbers, how you assess claims. And I used to think, and this is important because this word here is the important one, transferable, okay? It's about how what I would teach them today in the classroom would help them outside of the classroom. So for example, if I teach students how to analyze data, how to understand causation, how to identify variables, they'll be better able to understand, oh, you know, is the COVID vaccine really going to cause the government to be able to control my actions? Things like that. The idea is that you teach them how to be global citizens. So based on what you do in the class, they then become more informed and better able to make good decisions outside of the classroom. Okay, so just as a quick thumbs up, everybody with me so far? Fantastic. Okay. It's a bit difficult because normally when I do these sessions, I ask lots and lots and lots of questions, but I can't do that because it's a big group. So every so often I get very nervous. Every so often I might just ask you to do some thumbs up for me. So this was me. This is Adam 1, the first Adam, young Adam. The thing that has never changed across my career is that I've always been obsessive, or in English we say nerdy, about teaching and about learning and about education. So I used to read a lot, the whole time. I was always reading, I was always trying to learn textbooks, magazines, journals, blogs, everything. And most of the stuff that I read completely agreed with everything that I believed. Okay, and it was just about more of the same and teaching me how to do the things that I was doing better. And importantly, I was good at these things. When we train, I don't know what it's like over there, but when we train in a school, but we also train with the university. And people from the university would come to observe you teach, people from the school would come to observe you teach, and everybody always said that I was doing these things very, very well. And they were very pleased, and they would ask others to come and see me, and they would say, this is good practice. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And I was reading and I was reading and I was reading every morning, every weekend, reading the whole time. And then there was one paper that came across my desk. So it got sent to me. And it was this paper here. It was written by this man here, whose name is Professor Rob Coe. C-O-E, Professor Rob Coe. It's two F's in Professor? I don't know. I'm very bad at spelling. I say this to an audience. There we go. Professor's got two S's. Who knows? I don't know. I don't know. You spell it somehow. Professor. His name is Professor Rob Coe. And Professor Rob Coe, along with others, wrote this paper here that's called, let me see if I can find it. Here we go. What Makes Great Teaching? A review of the underpinning research. It's a short paper. It was published in 2014. So it's 10 years old now. And it was published by this group called the Sutton Trust here. Can you see here the Sutton Trust? And the Sutton Trust, they're like a charity, and their aim is to narrow the disadvantaged gap. So we have, across the Western world, we have two groups of students. We have students who are advantaged or who are rich, who have lots of money, and students who are disadvantaged, who do not have lots of money. And there is an education gap between them. And the Sutton Trust's job, their reason for existence is to try and close that gap and to lower educational inequality. And they wrote this paper called What Makes Great Teaching, where they wanted to summarize the evidence about what is good about teaching. Importantly, one of the things that they do here is they don't just talk about what makes good teaching, they also talk about what makes bad teaching. So one thing, for example, that they said makes bad teaching is something called using learning styles. Now, learning styles, you may have heard of. There are 3 learning styles: visual, audio, and kinesthetic. Oops, sorry. Visual, kinesthetic is things you can see. Audio, things you can hear. Kinesthetic is like movement. And the theory at the time was that different students learn best through different ways. So you could have one student whose name is David, and David is a good visual learner. And you could have another student whose name is Daniela, and she is a good audio learner. And you can have another student whose name is Sam, and Sam is a good kinesthetic learner. And what you had to do in every lesson was to make sure every activity was tailored, was built around those 3 different types of learning style. Now, what they said in What Makes Great Teaching is that this is nonsense. It is not true. There is no evidence base for it at all. Now, I already knew this. I knew that learning styles wasn't a thing. I knew that it was nonsense. So we can actually add that to young Adam lists. Adam knew that learning styles was nonsense. I knew that. So that was no problem. And I'm reading this paper and I'm nodding my head and everything's fine. And I keep reading these things about things that aren't good teaching and aren't good teaching. There was another one about giving students grades, right? There was a bit in there about when you give students back a paper, if you give them a grade, they focus on the grade and not the feedback. And actually, by the way, that paper, that research is Kluger and Denisi, 1996, published by Tel Aviv University, if I remember correctly. But it says very clearly there that if you give students a grade on their paper, they don't listen to the feedback anymore. And I knew that as well, and that was all great and fine. But then I read this one bit, and I'm going to put it up in English, and I'll talk it through so the translation can come through as well. So I'll just give you a second to read it, and then I'll say it again for the translation, yeah? So what this paper said is that allowing learners to discover key ideas for themselves is bad. Enthusiasm for discovery learning is not supported by research evidence, which broadly favors direct instruction. And direct instruction means telling the students everything they need to know. Although learners do need to build new understanding on what they already know, if teachers want them to learn new ideas, knowledge, or methods, they need to teach them directly. Now, you can imagine what that did to me. here I was for almost 2 years of my career, and this is the way that I'd been teaching. Discovery learning, inquiry learning, and I had thought, it had been my belief that this direct instruction was boring for students and not good for learning. I had believed that if a student discovers something for themselves, it is stronger in their memory, it's better, it's longer lasting in their memory. And when I read this, it's like a phrase in English, like the bottom fell out of my stomach, right? I just got that feeling in my stomach. It just fell away from me. And I thought, what have I been doing? I couldn't understand it at all. Because one of the things on my list, the things that Adam believed in, was this one here, about discovery and inquiry-based learning. And all of a sudden, someone's telling me this is bad. For me, this was a very difficult and challenging moment. So obviously what I did is I looked at the reference here, and it gave me this reference here to Kirshner et al. 2006. And this here is Professor Paul Kirshner. This is Professor Paul Kirshner. Just wave at me if you've heard of Professor Paul Kirshner. Okay, a few of us. Okay, so Professor Paul Kirshner is a cognitive scientist. So he works in the same field that Efrat works in. He works in the science of learning, the science of memory, the science of the brain. And in 2006, Kirshner and his colleagues wrote a paper. The paper has a very long title. It's called Why Minimal Guidance During Instruction Does Not Work, the Failure of Problem-Based, Inquiry-Based, Constructivist Approaches to Learning. Something along those lines. It's very long, it's a very boring title, but it's a very good paper. And what the paper does is it introduces a very simple theory. And the theory is this. If you imagine that this is my head, inside my head is my brain, and my brain consists essentially of two parts. The first part is called the working memory. And the working memory is where thinking takes place. Whenever what you right now, you're listening to me, everything that you're thinking about, that's happening in your working memory. It's not like a physical thing. It's a model, it's an idea, it's a way of understanding the brain. That there's a bit of the brain that's doing that thinking, that's doing that kind of processing over there. And there is also inside my brain something called the long-term memory. This is storage. This is where my memories get stored. I receive information from outside. I'm going to get rid of the head bit now. I receive information from outside. And that information comes to me via my senses. So I could see, I could touch, I could smell, I can hear. In the classroom, normally that's seeing and hearing. Okay? And that information comes into my head. Now, what we want is for that information to end up here. That is what we call learning. When information goes into my long-term memory. That's the point. You know, we have lots of arguments, lots of debates, lots of discussions. What's the point of education? Why do we do education? What's the point of teaching? Well, it's right here. This is it. To get stuff from the outside into students' long-term memory. That's it. That's the point. That's the summary. There is, however, a big problem. And the problem is that the problem is about kind of the sizes of these two things. So the long-term memory here, you can see I haven't really given it a bottom. I've left it open at the bottom. That's because the long-term memory is really big. Now, obviously, it can't be infinite. There has to be an end to it because it's housed within the brain, which is a physical structure. But we've not found the limit to it yet. So I used to teach a student and she'd say to me, Mr. Bokser, I can't do science today. I can't do science today because every time I learn something new, it pushes out something old. And if I do science today, I'll forget all the geography that I learned, and I really need the geography because I've got to pass my exams. That's not the way the brain works. Okay? There's lots and lots of space. There's plenty of space. There's plenty of storage. That's not the problem. The problem is the working memory, which is really quite small. It's constricted. It's like a bottleneck. And sometimes the way that I like to think about it is the working memory is kind of like this. So the long-term memory is like that. And we're trying to get information through the working memory into the long-term memory. But this hole here, oops, sorry, come back. But this hole here is really quite small. And the issue is that if I try and give too much information, it doesn't all go in. But as a teacher, I don't necessarily know what goes in and what doesn't go in. It's random, it's chance. And one student, if I say A, B, C, D, and E, one student might get A, one student might get B, one student might get B and C, one student might get a bit of D and a bit of E, one student might get E, one student might get A and B, but I don't really know what's going on. If I give them too much information at once, if I try and squeeze too much in there at once, nothing gets learnt. And Kirshner and his colleagues call this cognitive load. And it relates to the weight of information, the amount of things I am trying to teach my students at any given time. If I try and teach them too much, they don't learn anything because I'm trying to put too much through that very, very, very small hole. Now, the reason then that discovery learning doesn't work is because when a student tries to learn that information for themselves, they are bombarded. There is a huge amount of information just constantly coming at them. When they read a long, complicated text, there's so much there that's new. There's so much there that they don't know already, and it means they end up learning nothing. Whereas what Kirshner argues is that if you want to teach students A, B, C, D, and E, what discovery learning is the student does all of these at once and tries to just learn all of those at once. It's new information. They just get hit by it all at once. And that's called the discovery model. Whereas the direct instruction model is you have the same student like this, but you have a teacher as well. And first, the teacher teaches them A. When the teacher is happy, they move on to B. When the teacher is happy, they move on to C. And when the teacher is happy, they move on to D. So you go one by one by one by one by one. Instead of all at once, you do one by one. And this is called the direct or explicit instruction model. For most students, most of the time, this one is bad. It does not work for most students most of the time. And this one is good. For most students, most of the time, it works. It's more complicated than I've just suggested, but as an outline and as a summary. And they called this cognitive load. When I started doing some more reading, I came across this man here, which I suspect many of you have definitely not heard of. This man is called Frederick Rieff. Frederick Rieff escaped Nazi Germany after Kristallnacht. And interestingly, Frederick Rieff first tried to get to Cuba in South America, but the boat he was on got turned back and he ended up going back to Europe. And then eventually he made it to New York. And in New York, Frederick Rieff became, a relatively important physicist. So he used to teach physicist. He used to teach physics at a university. Later on in his life, he became very, very interested in not just physics, but how to teach physics. And he wrote this beautiful book, which is very, very, it's very complicated, and it took me a long time to finish it. But he wrote this amazing book where he tries to turn everything he learned about how to teach physics into formulae and into equations and into mathematical rules. One of the really important mathematical rules I'm going to start showing you today, and it is, again, you know, you can write entire books about this, so I'm really just giving you an overview more than anything, a summary more than anything. One of the rules he looked at was something called this. When you take the cognitive load of something, we know that cognitive load increases if you give people more things to do. So if we look back at this model, if we have more things, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, more things means more cognitive load, okay? It means it's harder. So what he said is that we can use a mathematical symbol, which is this symbol, which means it's, proportional. Proportional. It's proportional. Cognitive load is proportional to what he called task quantity. As the quantity of the task goes up, cognitive load goes up. That's the way to think about it. So as that goes up, so too does that go up. The more things you ask students to do, the higher the cognitive load. But what he did as well is and here, by the way, I'm now adding to his model. I'm making it more complicated. He added other factors too. So for example, one that I'm going to add is abstraction. If the idea you are teaching students is abstract, that is harder to understand, the cognitive load increases. I'll give you a good example. My daughter, she's 7. I can explain to her really easily why a polar bear is white. Polar bears are white because they live in the snow and it's easy for them to hide and be camouflaged. That's a very concrete idea. However, if I try talking to her about evolution by natural selection, and what that means, there's a random mutation that makes a polar bear more white, and that means it can survive better and survive for longer and pass on its genes to the next generation. And across the course of thousands and thousands of years, you end up with more polar bears that are white relative to polar bears that are less white. That's a lot harder because it's an abstraction, it's an idea. One is just something you can see, it's obvious, it's right there, and one is an idea. It's something that exists in the world of thought. However, we can also lower cognitive load, and that's how we divide. When you divide a sum, you make it smaller. One way to divide it is by using a support. So for example, when I first learnt to, I'll give you, great example. When I first learnt to type in Hebrew, okay, so I learned how to touch type in Hebrew. When I first learnt to type in Hebrew, on the keyboard, I put like these little stickers. You can't see them here because I don't have them on here, but you put these little stickers that tell you which letter goes with which one on the keyboard. That's called a support. It's something to help students. A calculator is a support. Pen and paper is a support. A periodic table is a support. Anything you give students to help them. And the more support you give, the lower cognitive load. So if you give support, cognitive load goes down. But critically, there is another factor here as well. And probably the most important factor for making the load lower and easier is prior knowledge. So the things that students know about this subject already. The more students know about this topic, the easier it is to learn the new thing. And in fact, we actually kind of referenced this already here, where it says here, although learners do need to build new understanding on what they already know. So I know Efrat is here, and Efrat talks about pyramids. She's got these lovely diagrams, which I'm sure if you ask her, she'll show you, where she looks at learning as like a series of triangles like this. And learning is all about adding new triangles on the top. And the stronger that base, the stronger the foundation, the easier it is to add more. And if you get rid of one of these, the whole lot just falls down. It doesn't work. The more prior knowledge a person has, the easier it is for them to learn something new. And prior knowledge then becomes the most important factor. When it comes to thinking and when it comes to learning. And in fact, this prior knowledge aspect explains why something else I believed was also wrong. Let's go back to my list earlier. So we already said that discovery and inquiry-based learning is bad, and that's because, sorry, of cognitive load theory. You're just asking students, essentially what you're doing is you're increasing the task quantity and decreasing the support. You're saying to students, I'm not going to give you any support and I'm going to give you loads of things to do. The cognitive load just goes way, way, way too high and they don't learn anything. But let's look at this one for a second, transferable skills, which I've definitely spelled it wrong. It's definitely only got one R. Yeah, I think it's only got one R. Transferable skills. So let's look at this. And what I like to do is give people an example, a really, really good example. So let's say I've got a student in my class. My student is called A. And in lesson 1, we do an experiment and we do an evaluation of the experiment. So evaluating an experiment is where you look at the method, you look at the instructions that you followed, and you try and figure out something that you could do better next time. So in this experiment, what we were doing is we had a cup and we had 2 substances that we put in the cup and we measured the temperature. And I explained to students, so you mix them together, temperature goes up and you measure the temperature. And I explained to students that this isn't a very good way of doing it. And a better way of doing it, an evaluation, would be to put a lid on the cup. Because putting a lid on the cup means that energy isn't lost to the surroundings and you can get a much, much better temperature reading. So the evaluation here is to use a lid. In the next lesson, we do another evaluation. But in this one, we're doing an experiment where we mix 2 substances together and we look for a color change. Okay, so it turns from red to green or from yellow to blue or whatever it is. And I say to students, well, we need to evaluate this. And I ask them, what could we do to improve this experiment? That's the question that I ask them. I don't tell them. I say, what can we do to improve this experiment? Now, the truth is, it's not just student A who's in the class. I also have student B. Now, student B is absent in the first lesson, i.e. they are ill, they miss the lesson or whatever, but they are present in the second lesson. Now, here's the question. When I ask them that question, can you evaluate this experiment? By the way, the answer, I don't tell the students, but the answer is to put a tile, a white tile underneath. Okay, so just like a square tile, like a piece of paper, because it's then easier to see the color change, right? Because if you've got a piece of white paper underneath or a white tile underneath, it's much easier to see the color change. I don't tell the students that, I just ask them, I say, how could I improve this experiment? Is student A at an advantage when it comes to answering that question compared to student B? No. Student A was in lesson 1. Student B was not in lesson 1. But that makes no difference to whether or not they can answer the question today. Why? Because it's a completely different thing. One is about using a lid to keep the temperature controlled, and one is about using a white tile to make it easier to see the color change. But they're both evaluation. They're both a transferable skill. Both of them involve thinking like a scientist. But the knowledge from one doesn't transfer to the other because there's nothing there. They don't know it. The only way for them to know that a white tile makes this experiment better is by me saying a white tile makes the experiment better. So the fact that one has done more thinking like a scientist and the other has done less thinking like a scientist actually makes no difference to their ability to transfer it, to look at it in a new situation. And that, again, just comes back to this very, very simple situation here, where without this prior knowledge, they can't do that thinking. So transferable skills, it's not a thing. They don't exist. It's tiny, tiny increments, tiny, tiny additions to the same skill. But fundamentally, without that knowledge, they're not going to be able to access the thing that you're trying to teach them. And what that led me to is figure out, right, well, if prior knowledge is so important, how then do I improve prior knowledge? How do I make students learn this stuff over the long term? How do I stop them forgetting things? And at that point, I came to a new paper. Can we just put thumbs up if you can still hear me and everything's still good? Ah, brilliant. Okay. And I took a new paper. We'll have to skip the Bjorks for the minute. And we're going to look at this paper here, which is called The Critical Importance of Retrieval for Learning. And this is by Rodiger and Karpicki. And it's a paper that I've studied many times, and I've studied these authors a number of times. And we don't have a huge amount of time to go into it, but broadly, what they're looking at is why humans forget things, and how humans forget things, and how we can stop humans forgetting things. They did a very, very clever experiment. And by the way, I'm summarizing here. This is not exactly what they did. I'm really, really just summarizing it. Okay. They took two groups. They took 100 people. This is called a randomized control trial. So you take 100 random people and you split them into two groups of 50. What we'll call group A and what we'll call group B. And what you do is you teach them some words in a foreign language. And the language that they chose was Swahili, which is a Kenyan dialect. The first group, they gave a bunch of flashcards. Sorry, my pen's being a bit funny today. They gave the first group flashcards that looked like this. They used the word mashua. So mashua in Swahili means boat. Who knew we were going to be doing English and Hebrew and Swahili all in one talk? So mashua means boat. And they gave them 40 cards like this. So 40 different words. They gave them an hour or whatever, 2 hours. They then waited a week. And again, I'm summarizing big time. They waited a week and they gave them a test on those words. They then went to the second group and they said, right, instead of giving you a flashcard that looks like that, we're going to give you a flashcard that has on one side the word mashua, and on the other side it has the word boat. And what you have to do is flip them over in order to see. Give them this 40 of those again, give them a week, and then do a test. What they found when they did this, and this has been replicated now in hundreds of experiments, is that group B did way better than group A. Like a lot better in that final test. They remembered things a lot better. And what the researchers theorized, their theory, is this. If we go back to our simple model of the brain, route A, when we had those flashcards that said mashua means boat over here, the way that they were learning them is they were looking at them, they were going, right, mashua means boat, mashua means boat, mashua means boat. And what that means is that the information is constantly coming from outside. How do I know that mashua means boat? Because I can see it right here. I look at it, I go, mashua means boat, mashua means boat, mashua means boat. It's constantly coming from outside. The hope then is that it goes down like that. The other route doesn't work like that. The other route is almost the opposite. Because I give you the card that says mashua, and you have to think for yourself, oh, what does mashua mean? And you have to go looking in your memory, and it goes that way. And you say, oh, it means boat. Stop doing that. Sorry. I just got rid of my whole model. Come back. There we go. It's the exact opposite. Instead of the information coming, instead of the answer coming to me from outside, the answer has to come from inside. I have to pull it up out of my brain. And they called that process retrieval. Now, in English, retrieve means to fetch, to get, to bring, lahavi. It means to find the thing. And retrieving it out of the long-term memory is what these researchers said, excuse me, strengthens that memory over the long term. When we constantly receive the information from the outside, when it's all completely given to us and completely given to us and completely given to us, and we don't have to do any work at all, that means that actually it doesn't get remembered over the long term. It gets forgotten. And what we have to do is retrieve and go hunting and go searching. So when we add this to our model, what we can say is that prior knowledge is important in thinking and learning, and it's best done or supported by retrieval over time. Now, this here, when you look at it, is fundamentally now the way that I think about teaching and about learning. And before we wrap up, I am actually going to go back and we're going to look at these last two scientists. This is called Robert and Elizabeth Bjork. Okay, I think they're a married couple. They are, again, cognitive scientists. They work in America. And what Robert and Elizabeth Bjork did is they looked at equations like this. And they said, what we need to do in order to support good learning is to make sure this cognitive load is perfectly balanced. And what do I mean by that? If it's too high, no learning takes place. If it's too difficult, if I've given students too much, or it's too abstract, or there's not enough support, or there's not enough prior knowledge, no learning takes place. But the opposite is true as well. If it's too low, no learning also takes place. If I only give my students a tiny bit of new information, or it's not abstract at all, or I give them way too much support, or they're working in something they already know, they're also not going to learn anything. And they called this, it's a really lovely phrase, they called it a desirable difficulty, which is where the learning is difficult, but in a desirable sense. I want it to be the perfect level of difficulty. This here, what you're looking at now, there is more to add, but we don't have long, and I promised that there'd be questions at the end. This here now, fundamentally, is if this is Adam 1, the first Adam, young Adam, Adam who didn't really understand anything about teaching and learning, this here is Adam now, older Adam, Adam who is lucky that he's had the chance to read, he's had the chance to understand, and knows a bit more about learning, and understands that the key elements of learning are this. One, we want our students to learn material in a way that has a desirable level of difficulty. There are 4 variables, 4 things we can do to make that level of difficulty perfect, balanced, and desirable. We can increase or decrease the task quantity. We can add more or take away. We can make things more abstract or less abstract. We can give students support, things to help them along the road, and we can make sure that they have the prior knowledge over time. And the way we do that is via retrieval. And with that, my friends, I'm going to stop. And I'm going to invite, in case anyone has any questions. Thank you guys so much. Like I said, it's a genuine honor to be able to present and to be able to talk to you. And please, if you have anything you wanted to talk to me about, I'll put my contacts back up here. I can see Efrat's coming up to the stage, so you can email me, no problem. And there's way more reading, way more stuff. Basically, this book, by the way, here, there's like the whole book is based on that one equation. Okay, so it's 400 pages all about how that equation builds up over time. So please do feel free to get that. And in the meantime, have a wonderful day. And I look forward to hearing from you guys.
Thank you so much.